Thanks for joining us. I am Andy Korge. We're here this morning with my good friend, publicist John Kiskinis is joining me. And in about 10 minutes, we're going to have noted South Florida, Miami historian Dr. Paul George, joining us here. And we're going to talk a little bit about Miami history, history of Miami politics and politicians here in South Florida, and edify you a little bit about our community and some of the great things and some of the great history of the South Florida and Miami-Dade County community. And John, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Andrew, always a pleasure. You told me Paul George was coming. And every time I have a 3-minute conversation with Paul George, it usually ends up being an hour and 20 minutes. But I walk away with a wealth of knowledge. It's great. I'm looking forward to it.
It really is. You know, I love talking to Paul because it makes my job easy. I can ask him a question and he could weave the most perfect 5-minute or 10-minute story off of just one question. So we're going to keep a count on all the questions I asked today. And I bet it will be maybe an all-time record for the least amount of questions.
I think you might be onto something. You're hitting a couple topics. Paul George he rubs elbows with the stars, the political stars.
Yes, he does.
I've been to, I think, 1 or 2 fundraisers in my life. In both times, Paul George was there.
Paul George.
I don't know what's up with that.
Well, he's, you have the psychic to the stars. You might remember that. Paul George is the historian to the stars.
You could be right.
I think so. He's professor, history, Miami. And so he'll be joining us shortly. But John, I want to tell you about something. And I got a picture. Yesterday on the program, we were talking about the hair plugs that Michael Miller has. And so I wanted to bring up this picture today. If you can see that is Michael Miller right there. That's Michael.
Oh.
Look at the hairline there. Okay. This was taken some years ago. That's with former vice presidential candidate Lieberman, right? I forget his first name. Joe Lieberman. Look, there he is with his hair plugs. Look at it then. And then if you see Michael Miller now, Michael Miller has the greatest hair plugs ever. I mean, I've been bothering him to find out about who that doctor is. Maybe you and I could go together.
I was going to say, if 2 people could probably learn something from that conversation. I'm speaking for myself, of course, because I want to be back again on the show one day. So I will just go with, Michael, when we're done, let's go talk to him.
Yeah, we'll talk to him, find out about the doctor. Every day when I come on here, I look at myself and I go, oh my God, I don't have Paul George type hair here. I've got this, I've got this going on. That's why I grew the beard, so people would stop looking at my head. I was thinking Judaism is the way to go because I could put a yarmulke on the back and it would cover up this bald spot back here. But no, I was walking down one of the hallways here at Miami Community Newspapers, and I saw that photo, and I just had to grab it off the wall and show what a before and after shot looks like.
It goes to the point. Maybe Michael and Grant. Grant's got a full head of hair. Is there something we really want to dig into on one of the shows? I don't know. As I mentioned about Judaism, as you know, the Miller brothers are Jewish,
right?
And
apparently Grant has found the religion again. He's found his religion again because he is getting the same dome baldness in the back that I have.
I'm familiar with that too.
You're familiar. And so he's really found his religion because he wants to put that yarmulke on and cover up his baldness.
It's a devastating thing, and I can understand Michael probably very sensitive about it. I know the first words out of my daughter's mouth were "Dad," and then when she learned to speak, she was telling me about the spray that you could get and just spray the back of your head so I can have hair in the back. So I can understand he's probably taken he's had a lot of rough go of it.
It actually, that spray, I did actually buy it once for a Halloween costume. And it actually works pretty good.
It didn't rain, I hope.
Because
you would have been Giuliani.
I would have been
drip.
I would have been Rudy Giuliani once again. Yep. So, well, a couple items in the news. Mitch McConnell is trying to put off the impeachment for a couple weeks. He thinks that it's the only way that we could fairly provide due process to former President Trump. Democrats want to rush the impeachment to the floor. I think it's important that we don't let him stand unaccountable. And so we'll see how that pans out with a 50-50 Senate conviction. They would need 60 votes to convict President Trump. Also, it was announced as one of the executive orders, it was announced that now people coming into the United States, traveling into the United States, will have to present a COVID test showing that they are negative before coming into the United States, and will have to serve a period of time of quarantine, not yet determined. Quotes from the Greater Miami Convention and Visitor Bureau indicate that it will not have much of an effect on our international tourism, as that number has decreased tremendously since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. So, well, now that we've got that behind us, let's talk to Paul George, if we could bring him on. Paul, Professor George, good to have you here at Miami.
Great to be here, Andy, and great to see that John Kiskinis has joined us also. I think that's terrific.
Really see you, Paul. Good to see you. Good to see you. So before we get started, talk a little bit about Miami history. Let's talk about History Miami. I want to get, just a little bit about it. People don't really know about History Miami as much as maybe they should. And it's an incredible place now. Talk a little bit about the facility, and is it open? People really can't tour it now, or they can? Tell us what's going on over there at History Miami.
Thanks, Andy. It's really a wonderful organization. It was founded in 1939, 1940. I think it was chartered in 40. So we've been around a long time. The museum, where it is today, actually occupies two buildings in the Cultural Center that was designed by Philip Johnson back in the late 70s. And we are open from Thursday through Sunday. We reopened, I think, early fall of 2020 after being closed for a while because of the pandemic. A lot of exhibitions are still going on. Great research center, which isn't open, although it might be by appointment. But there's a lot of visitors coming in. There's very strict protocols now in terms of how many people can be in at a time. There's permanent exhibitions all over the museum in both buildings. We publish a journal. I'm editor of Tequesta. It's an annual journal on Miami, South Florida, even Caribbean history to some degree. That's been going on since 1941. Contributors included Margie Stoneman Douglas, George Merrick, and others. I've been conducting tours for History Miami since 1988, and it's been family, truly, Andy. I've worked with Miami-Dade for almost 30 years, from 1990 till I retired a few years ago. But I've always had History Miami also as an organization I'm closely affiliated with. And I was doing, on a normal year, even as recently as 2019, probably through History Miami, over 100 tours a year. That would be private tours, public tours, things of that nature. It's been a marvelous experience with them. And it's family. It's a small staff. We all work closely together. We just get along, and it's been that way for my 33 years of being a member of the staff. So I'm delighted to be part of it, and we're looking forward to more normality later this year, as everybody is, and to get out in the field again with regular tours. I really miss that human contact. I'm gregarious, just like you and John are, and really want to be face to face with people. So,
and for anyone that hasn't been, I know you have, John, as well. Paul George's walking tours are one of the great, in my opinion, one of the great attractions of South Florida. And a lot of people don't know about that, the walking tours. But what are you doing? You mentioned before the show, you're doing it virtually now. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Right. We're doing virtual tours. The museum has over 1 million images, and almost all of those electronic. And so what we've done over the last many months since the pandemic set in is I've taught classes for History Miami and given lectures and given virtual tours. And each has been driven by the great electronic photographs we have. So I'm doing a Biscayne Boulevard tour next Friday evening, the 29th, I believe it is, from 6 until 7. And we'll start somewhere on Bayfront Park, around Flagler and Bayfront Park, and just walk north, probably pretty close to the Arts Center, then come back down. And all of that is being driven by these photographs arranged sequentially. So, there'll be the park, and then there'll be what had been the Bayfront Park Auditorium and the submarine chaser training school in World War II. We'll see photos of that, and all the way up, the boulevard, and then come back down at the great hotels of yesteryear, like the McAllister and the Columbus. So we're going to do a virtual tour for the public once a month, and it's really affordable. It's like $5 for members, $15 for the public who's not members. So it's just great to engage the public during a time when a lot of us are sequestered, and we can do it this way.
Well, Paul, like Andrew said, I've had the benefit of going on a couple. I've done the Coconut Grove tour many times. I've done a Little Havana tour. I mean, the amount of information that you pass on to people, not just with the history, but innuendos and, everything from, what they were serving for dinner on a couple occasions. I think I've heard from you.
Yes.
It's pretty amazing, the details and the knowledge that you pass on to people in the community. I highly recommend, if the opportunity is presented, whether it be virtual now, definitely jump on it. But hopefully when things get back to normal and you can get outdoors and do the walk and see some of the sites, it is totally recommended. It is an amazing experience.
What is you mentioned the photo archives. Tell us a little bit about that. I wasn't aware that they had this archive of incredible photos and things documenting, Miami.
It's huge, and it's been accumulated over a period of 80 years. It comes from private collections. It comes from the Miami News, which became defunct, as you know, at the end of 1988. It's coming from a lot of Herald stuff now. It's coming from different archives around the area. It's amazing what they have. Anything you want in Miami, and to some degree South Florida beyond Miami, they have in there photography-wise. I've used it on some of the books I've written. I've gone right there for the photographs I've needed to embellish those books. And they have everything you want, from Deep South Dade up to today's Aventura, which used to be sort of a series of rock pits for cement manufacturers in that area. Anything you want, and it goes way back in time. Our first photographs of the area that we know of were taken by Ralph Monroe, a Coconut Groveite, beginning at the outset of the 1880s. And then his uncle Alfred came down from New England, and he took photos. We have those collections. So those collections will show you the New River in Fort Lauderdale in the 1880s, or the Miami River at the same time, or Biscayne Bay. And, it's the proverbial cliche that a photo is worth 1,000 words. You look at the mouth of the river in 1885 and say, this can't be. Today we've got the third densest skyline in the country, and much of that is on both sides of the Miami River downtown. And to look at it 125, 130 years ago, it's stunning to see the difference. So they have accumulated this. They bought a lot of photographs, a lot of collections, and they continue to put them out there. You could actually go online, historyofmiami.org, and somehow you could get to photos and just see the names of the collections and samples of some of the photos they have. But you can spend a lifetime in there. There's so many photographs. And they're all accessible. The public buys it. There's different people in the research at different times, different projects. We use them for exhibitions. It's been just great. It really has been. It's like a kid in a candy store for me when I go down there. I've been going down there forever, and will continue to, hopefully. So, that photographic collection is something else.
Paul, one of the exhibitions I had the great pleasure of going to, and it was many years ago, but it left such a lasting memory. I still look forward to telling people about it. There was a Jackie Robinson tour at the History Miami Museum. And it was, like I said, a few years ago, I was able to meet his widow, Rachel Robinson, I believe. Yes. I don't know whether you were probably aware or maybe even involved in that tour, but it was the exhibition was phenomenal, as most all of the exhibitions that they have are pretty impressive. There have been so many that I've had the pleasure of attending.
Well, they had these spectacular open nights also. The opening nights are great, and that's when you'd find Rachel Robinson there. Incidentally, as an aside, way back in 1972, when I was going to school at Florida State, just before I left, there was a United Way gathering down at the Everglades Hotel, and Jackie Robinson and Rachel were there. And I had the good fortune of meeting Jackie, and he was still a very handsome man. He was only in his 50s. He was wearing pretty thick glasses, and he was so open. He said, "I just want to share something with you. I've got a really bad case of diabetes, and it's really impaired my eyesight, and that's why I'm wearing these glasses." I mean, it's a very open sort of guy. And I went back to school, and lo and behold, he passed away of a heart attack within a couple of months of that.
Wow.
But Rachel was always by his side, and she was a fantastic person.
Wow. Well, let's get into some questions regarding history. And this is going to be history 101 for Paul George. But to many people that'll be watching this program, whether live or later, maybe don't know some of this information. So here, let's start with this. Is it true that Miami is the only major city in the United States founded by a woman? Tell us about that.
It is true to the best of our knowledge. Julia Tuttle is clearly the founder of Miami. She was able to importune Henry Flagler with the offer of land and all to move his railroad south from West Palm Beach, where it had stopped in 1894, to the north bank of the Miami River in April of 1896. Now, she was assisted in many ways by another woman, Mary Brickell, because Mary Brickell threw in choice land right on the other side of the river, because the Brickels owned everything in that Brickell Avenue neighborhood, all the way down to where the Marlin Ballpark and the river lie today. They had thousands of acres of land south of the river. And because of river snakes, they also had land west of the river. So Julia just would not give up in her quest to open up Miami to development. She had bought 640 acres back in the late 1880s, and nobody was here. The Florida State Census of 1895 found 9 people living along the Miami River at its mouth. The next year, the railroad's in. You'd have an incorporated city on July 28, 1896, of about maybe 700 people. So it changed overnight. And that was really Julia Tuttle's persistence. Sadly, she died 2 years later. We think either a brain aneurysm or a brain tumor. It was a shock to most people. They didn't know she was sick, and she went fast. She lived about where the Hyatt Regency is in downtown Miami today, on the river.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Here, how about this one? The Magic City. Everyone knows Miami as the Magic City. How did we get that nickname?
It's a great story. This guy, Ethan V. Blackman, was a minister, a publicist, a chronicler, a biographer, and he was working for the Flagler organization up in Sanford, Florida. And apparently Flagler's people made contact with him saying, "Listen, you got to write something really glowing about this brand new city of Miami." This is now in the late summer of 1896. And Flagler had sent him a note about the promise of Miami and the future of the place and how unique it was, its subtropical ambiance. Blackman had never been here, and he wrote this story, and he called it the Magic City. And he explained this 30 years later. He explained it in an article that appeared, I believe, in the Miami News. I've read the article. I have a copy of it somewhere. And he called it the Magic City, as he put it, because of the glowing tribute to its future by Henry Flagler in that note that Flagler had sent him. Now, there's one other thing we need to note about this. Birmingham was calling itself the Magic City of the South at the same time. So I often wonder if Blackman maybe didn't borrow a little bit of that from Birmingham, at that time to add to his creativity. Let's put it that way. And incidentally, one of the things I'd love to do, and I'll do right after the show, is take a walk through the neighborhood. I live in Shenandoah, Little Havana, and I'm going to walk down in the direction of the old Orange Bowl site, and I will walk past a lot that's now being developed for the first time since this house went down. The house was the home of E.V. Blackman, the guy we're talking about, in what was called Riverside Heights, because it's a little bit hilly there. And somebody knocked it down about 25 years ago, travesty. And finally, they're building something on it now. It's on Northwest 2nd Street, just west of Northwest 15th Avenue. And it's a great old neighborhood. We knew it as Riverside generically. And I spent my first 8 years around that area. It was just great.
Miami. Where does the name come from? How did you get the name Miami?
It's interesting, Andy. There were a group of native Floridians known as the Miami Indians, Miayami, something like that. That spelling, that lived on the west side of Lake Okeechobee. In fact, Lake Okeechobee in some of the early maps was known as Lake Miami. But by the 1830s and 40s, you begin to hear a reference to the Miami River. It had different names before that. It had been called the Garbrand River when the British controlled Florida, the Lemon River when the British controlled Florida, Sweetwater River, different names. But you begin to see, and I've seen it in my research, in the 1830s and 1840s, it's being called the Miami River. Meanwhile, Lake Okeechobee is being called Lake Okeechobee. At one point, it was known as Lake Miami, again with that different spelling. So that happened, but it wasn't as easy as that, because there was an alternate name for what we know as Miami today, and that was Fort Dallas, because there had been an Army fort built on the Miami River, about where the Hyatt Regency is today, in that area, or just a little bit east of there. That was called Fort Dallas for a naval officer who had been in the area in the 1820s. It was built in the late 1830s during something called the Second Seminole War, which involved the Miami area. And then there was, they reactivated the fort in 1849 during a so-called Indian Scare, and they used it again during the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858, Fort Dallas. So if you came to this area in the early 1890s, you might hear the term Fort Dallas applied to it as much as you would the term Miami. What makes it Miami officially was that incorporation election in downtown Miami on July 28, 1896, when the voters had a choice. Are we going to call it Fort Dallas, or are we going to call it Miami? There were over 300 voters at that meeting, and they voted to call it Miami. That's where that comes from. See, Fort Lauderdale blew it because they kept the name Fort Lauderdale, but the beach in Fort Lauderdale until the early 1940s was called Los Olas, which is a much more romantic name than Fort Lauderdale. The Chamber of Commerce pushed in the early 1940s in Fort Lauderdale saying, listen, we own that beach, but people don't understand it because it's called Los Olas. So let's get, an ordinance that names it Fort Lauderdale Beach. Well, I think it's much more romantic for a tourist resort like Lauderdale to be called Los Olas, the waves, than Fort Lauderdale. But they didn't see it that way, obviously.
Wow. Now, Miami Beach, Paul, I go to Miami Beach periodically. Man,
Right.
Incredible nightlife. There's partying going on, restaurants, beautiful hotels, Art Deco. But Miami Beach was a swamp at one time?
It was swampy in the interior because it was concave. There was this the recessed area in the interior which collected water, which gave rise to mangrove trees. Mangrove trees normally grow at water's edge. They can grow inland to some degree too, but because of that swampy concave nature of the interior, you had mangroves there too. So Carl Fisher, who was the first major early developer of Miami Beach, he paid all kinds of money. He had a lot of money for these special pumps and these different kinds of machines, and he just leveled all of that, and he built Lincoln Road. He idolized Abraham Lincoln, and that was going to be the great fashion street, which it was. And he envisioned this as another Rue de la Paix, which you have in Paris, which used to be a great shopping street in Paris. And that would link, Lincoln Road would link his hotels on the bay side with the ocean and the ocean front. And but he's the one that cleared out that mangrove swamp. And I mean, it was impenetrable. You couldn't get through there from one point to another. Your only hope was to go to the southern tip where there were these bathing casinos, and there was a boardwalk that would take you from the bay over to the ocean. So it was quite a job. He did this in the 1910s. And Miami Beach was poised for development after that. It incorporated as a city, as a town, first of all, in 1915.
What would you say is the biggest event to change South Florida or Miami? Would it have been Flagler's Railroad, the completion of Flagler's Railroad into South Florida? Would it have been the Mariel boat lift? What do you think is the one event that has really changed Miami the most?
Well, it's a great question, Andy. You'll get a real kick out of this. I was the unofficial historian for a TV station called Whammy that used to broadcast. You may remember it. Yeah, on Lincoln Road.
Yeah, my old cohort, Neil Rogers, when I worked at WIOD, used to have a program on Whammy, so I remember it very well.
Oh, that's great. Well, it was very interesting. It was very informal. and they had 2 young guys who were newscasters. And so I would provide them with different historical topics, and we would use History of Miami's photographic resources to embellish the topics and all. And so 1999 segued into the new century 2000, and they said, listen, we want you to come up with a top 10 list, the 10 most important influences on the development of Greater Miami. And we want you to come on. It's going to be New Year's night, and you'll sit with us on this show. It was a newscast. It came on around 8 o'clock at night or something. And so I came over there. I didn't tell them ahead of time my choices, and we had a countdown, and we got down to number 2, and it was Henry Flagler. And then we got down to number 1, and it was Fidel Castro. And they kind of looked at each other like, whoa, wait a minute. And then they said, well, you know something? Come to think of it, his coming to power and the attendant influx of so many Cuban refugees and then other peoples from other parts of the Caribbean and Latin America and Central America, maybe this guy has something here. So I saw Castro as the chief influence on its development. That doesn't mean, and there's this conventional mistake that a lot of people make, that there wasn't much going on here prior to 1959. This place was booming prior to 59. It just became even more of a booming place after 1959. And of course, it became an international city because of the tremendous Cuban influx, followed by so many other ethnic groups.
Yeah, that my dad often, you know, God rest his soul, when he was alive, would tell me how much he kind of edified me on how much South Florida changed, Miami changed with the influx of the Cuban immigration into South Florida in the early 60s.
Right.
So it certainly was probably, as you said, I didn't think about that. Probably the biggest change in our city was probably a direct result of Castro coming into power into Cuba. That makes all the sense in the world. Well, let's delve into a little politics. And
Okay.
Tommy, do you have that video that I sent you? I want to play something for you in a moment, but we know that South Florida and Miami has had quite an impact, especially recently, on national politics. And, you know, the Versailles, as an example, seems to be a stopping point for everybody running for president of the United States. You can't run for president of the United States and not stop at Versailles and have a cup of Cuban coffee. But I want to show you something I picked from my little archive, if you will, from 1963. Let's take a listen. It'll come up. You can get right past that. There you go.
Millions more live in rural areas and suffer from easily curable diseases, yet without hope.
Yeah, it's hard to hear, but what that was, Paul, was President John F. Kennedy, November of 1963. I believe the date was November 16th or 17th, just a mere week or less before he was assassinated in Dallas. His last public appearance at the Americana Hotel in downtown Miami, speaking about Latin America. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, he came down, and John Kennedy was a frequent visitor to the area, as you know. His family, of course, had that compound in Palm Beach, and he loved to come down to the Orange Bowl. He was down here for a couple of New Year's Day football games just a few years prior to that, while president. And I think one time as president-elect, but he came down to speak. I believe that was the image for the AFL-CIO meeting at the Americana Hotel, and he came for that too. And then he was at the airport and said goodbye there. I think his good buddy George Smathers was with him, and he took off. And you know, that sad day in Dallas occurred less than a week later, as you've indicated. Incidentally, there's some incredible film. Dante Facel, who was very close to your family and a great human being. Dante was at a sort of like a Rotary Club meeting or something, some kind, when news broke about John Kennedy's death. And Dante just had to really hold himself to collect himself. He got up and he said, I just have terrible news for you. I think he was a speaker at this gathering in Miami.
Wow.
And Dante probably saw him when he was here for that AFL-CIO meeting. But yeah, Kennedy loved to come down. In fact, one of his more interesting visits was when he welcomed back the Bay of Pigs prisoners right after Christmas of 1962, and he promised a free Cuba, and they gave him a flag of Cuba, and he said, he looked forward to the day when that would happen. His wife spoke flawless Spanish, and she spoke to the group. It was in the Orange Bowl. He arrived by helicopter on the north side of the Orange Bowl, and it was in the Orange Bowl on a beautiful day. I think it was December 28th, 1962. So he was down here a good bit. I saw him once in the Orange Bowl when I was a kid, and I remember seeing him on TV. This before he was president. So, my gosh, that's Senator Kennedy. And he was at a hot dog stand putting mustard on a hot dog, and he was wearing a tweed jacket. I'd never seen a tweed jacket in my life because it's so warm down here. I said to myself, I know this guy's wealthy, but why is he wearing that old coat? I was just about 10 years old or something at the time. So, we have all these great memories. Miami has been a crossroads for visitors, prominent and otherwise, forever.
Can you talk a little bit about President Richard Nixon and his affection for Key Biscayne?
That is really one of the great stories. And while I wasn't a Nixon fan, I came to learn of his story of Key Biscayne and his closeness with Bibi Rebozo. I had lunch, as well as with others, with Bibi Rebozo twice back in the early 80s. One time it was with the cast of WKRP in Cincinnati, who came down for a fundraiser for the Boys Club. And I sat next to Bibi. I was lucky enough to do that. Another time we went out to the Westview Country Club, which was a Jewish country club way out in Northwest Dade. And it was just a couple of us, and there was Bibi. And he was so nice. I said, tell me about your friendship with President Nixon. He always called him President. You always had to call him President Nixon. And he talked about how, and let me just tell you the story real fast. Nixon had won this bruising senatorial race in California against Helen Gahagan Douglas in the fall of 1950. George Smathers had won a bruising race against Claude Pepper same time. They had been friends in the Congress, even though they were in different political parties. Nixon turned to Smathers in the latter part of 1950 before being sworn in as a senator, and he said, I got to get out of this cold weather in Washington. I got a terrible cold. I got to get out of here. Smathers, listen, I've got a good buddy who lives in a place called Key Biscayne near Miami. I'm going to give him a call. Maybe he'll host you. And so Nixon came down. Bibi told me, he said, first time I met him, I really didn't like him. He was kind of standoffish and just, looked like everything was suspicious to him. But he invited himself down the next year, 1951, and we became the best of friends. And I later saw Bibi at a talk I was given before the Key Biscayne Realtors. This is now 1996. Bibi looked great, a little bit heavy, but looking great. Just married. And I said, when did you last see the president? He was always the president. And he said, I was with him when he passed away. That's how close they were. Wow. So in between 1950 and 1996, Nixon was down here all the time. That's why Key Biscayne became the Winter White House. Nixon bought a place. It was only like 25, 30,000. It was a Mackle house, I believe, on the bay side of Key Biscayne. Yeah. And that's where the Winter White House, that's where the Watergate cover-up was hatched in 1972. So they were the best of friends. And it always endeared me, that story, to both of those guys. Bibi was a wonderful guy. Nobody could make black beans and rice like Bibi, and nobody could barbecue steaks like Bibi. He was the uncle, never had children of his own. He was the uncle to Nixon's two daughters. I mean, they just revered him. So it's a great story of those two guys. And one of the things, somebody else once told me this, that one of the many things Nixon liked about Bibi was nothing that was supposed to be confidential ever got beyond Bibi. He was just very closed-mouthed in terms of his friendship with the president. And it was true. But it was just a great friendship. Bibi was in Washington a lot with Nixon. It was just, Pat Nixon loved to come down and visit also. And she liked to read a lot. So at the Winter White House, she would read a lot. But Nixon was always in there with aides as well as with Bibi, who lived next door. In fact, the house he lived in was sold to him by George Smathers. See, Bibi and Smathers went back to Miami High. They graduated in the early 30s from Miami High as good friends and maintained that friendship all those years and decades.
And we know that Smathers was a groomsman in John F. Kennedy's wedding, right?
He certainly was. He was the head usher in that wedding.
Yes.
And, it was a major thing. It's just so interesting the way Smathers was a bridge between Nixon, a Democrat, and Kennedy, a Republican. But in more civilized times, after that highly contentious election in 1960 for president, and a very close election, very narrow victory, they met at Key Biscayne at the Key Biscayne Hotel, that beautiful hotel with those villas. They met there, Nixon and Kennedy. This was a week after the election, and Nixon could have been bitter and everything else. He wasn't. There's these photographs of them smiling. I mean, it was a great gathering of these two guys. Just good stuff between them. Really, it was a different time.
Paul, real quick question. Obviously, you don't see this nowadays, but correct me if I'm wrong. The 72, both the Republican and Democratic conventions were held at Miami Beach, were they not?
They certainly will, and it was a very interesting time because you had the yippies here, you had the hippies here. The city of Miami Beach turned over parts of Flamingo Park as kind of like an encampment for the demonstrators, the protesters. And the reason Miami got the second gathering, I believe, was the Democratic convention, if I'm not mistaken. The first was the Republican. The reason why they got one of the conventions was that San Diego was a designated place for one of the party's conventions. I can't remember which one it was, and that fell through. So they said, well, look, we've got the convention center here. We're hosting a convention. We can host another one a month later. That's why they had both. But it was interesting, that whole activism wasn't as crazy as people thought. You'd have to have heard these words from Rocky Pomerantz, who was the police chief of Miami Beach, to really get a sense of what was going on, because he was kind of like in charge of keeping a lid on the place. And his command headquarters was the Botanical Garden office behind the convention center, where the Botanical Gardens from Miami Beach are.
Mhm.
And it's just great. As the story goes, he was quoting Plato to the demonstrators. Rocky was the greatest schmoozer on the planet. You've never seen a guy schmooze like Rocky. A great guy, besides.
Yeah, and as the convention 72, after what happened in 68 with what they call the riots in Chicago and the Chicago 7, and how peaceful it went here, he was really lauded for being able to host two, not one but two. I believe it was the only time in the history of the U.S. that the party's conventions were held in the same city in the same year. He was really lauded for.
He was really lauded. It's interesting, Andy. He shared an anecdote with me one time. His wife was a real attractive woman, a model, middle-aged model, and so she made good money. And she turned to him during one of the nights of the convention. He said, she said, the world is watching you, and if the beach can maintain order at this convention during these highly contentious times. These times were winding down. This is now 72, but there was still a lot of contentiousness. And she said, there's something unjust about it. She said, I can make more in a night or a day of modeling than you can make in a week or two. And look at the obligation that you have in front of you this week versus what I do. And I remember him telling me that story. It's very interesting stuff.
Well, it's much like in I think almost every state in the United States, the highest paid public official is either a football or a basketball coach. So go figure that, right?
No, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
It is.
It's funny, Paul, before we leave the convention, I believe, because my dad was a Miami-Dade police officer, and I think he was assigned.
Yes.
He was assigned to be either Nixon's driver or accompany Nixon through that period. Yeah.
Wow.
And one of the biggest thrills, obviously, my dad was an old movie buff. I guess Reagan was probably the governor of California there in and around that time, or very involved.
He should have been. He was.
He was down here.
Yes, he was.
He was down here, and my dad, he could care. I mean, he was a Republican, but he was more inclined to tell me about how he met Ronald Reagan, the movie star actor, as opposed to driving around with Nixon.
Well, there's so many interesting stories about that I wanted to share with you. Now that we're on to history and the politics and all, I had lunch with Senator Smathers in the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, and a man who was very close to him, Sloan McRae, who'd been one of his campaign managers. And the senator was very, very old at the time. He was in his late 80s, and he wasn't entirely lucid. So we went to lunch at the Miami City Club. It was the three of us, and you have to wear a coat and tie. So I was teaching at Miami-Dade College, and I just kind of took the Metro Mover down there and joined them. I had on a blazer and a tie and all that. And they were sitting across from me, and I noticed that both of them had PT 109 tie bars. And of course, I asked the logical question, where did you get them from? And the answer, of course, was President Kennedy had given them those two tie bars. Wow. So, it's just these fascinating connections that we have in Miami with everything, it seems, of import.
Ronald Reagan, was he the guy that started the whole Versailles thing? How did Versailles start? I mean, we were good friends with Felipe Valls, the Valls family owns Versailles La Carreta. And he couldn't, one day I asked him, and he couldn't even really explain how it developed, but I think it was President Reagan. Am I right?
Yeah, he was really instrumental in that whole thing. Versailles was a small flower shop when Philippe Valls bought it in 1971. He converted it into a restaurant, and it became very popular. And that's an area of town that's really not Little Havana. It's kind of a nondescript, boring neighborhood. But the Versailles is larger than life thing there. It's taken over the whole block and another block and what have you. And as he became more and more successful, he just expanded the thing. Meantime, President Reagan and the Republicans wanted to enlist more and more support from the Cuban community, in part by taking a hard line against not just communism, but talking about the overthrow of Castro and things of that nature. So one of the things that Reagan and the Republicans did was Reagan became president in 1981, in January of 81. They began to push for the naturalization of a lot of Cubans who had held out the hope that they'd go back to Cuba, that Castro would be overthrown, but it became unlikely by 1980. So many became naturalized citizens, and then they had this tremendous registration campaign to register them as Republicans. And it was, Felipe Valls was a big part of that, as was Jorge Mascanosa with the Cuban American National Foundation. And so you found by the latter part of the 80s, the Cubans were solidly in the camp of Republicans, in large part because of what Reagan and the Republicans had done at that time. Incidentally, you were speaking about Reagan and Miami and all. He came down for Cuban Independence Day in 1983, and this was part of that drive to enlist more and more support from Cubans. And he spoke at the La Esquina de Tejas restaurant. He had lunch there. He ate everything on his dish, and waved to the crowd, and he had a lot of charisma. He was at that point about 73, I believe, but still had a lot of charisma. Then he went to the Dade County Auditorium, and again, his talks were hardline, anti-Castro, anti-communism. And the next day, the Miami Herald headline was "Superstar Wows Little Havana." I thought that was pretty good. But we got another Miami connection with President Reagan. There was a guy, his name was Jerry Parr, and his parents were divorced. He lived near the Orange Bowl in Riverside Heights. His father saw him only sporadically. Every time he saw him, like once a month, he would take him to the movies. So he picks him up in 1939. Jerry's about 9 years old. Picks him up in 1939, takes him to the Tower Theater on Cayocho and 15th, then known as the Tamiami Trail. They saw a movie. It was something about the courage of the Secret Service, starring a young Ronald Reagan. And Jerry Parr made a vow to himself, I want to become a Secret Service agent when I grow up. Apparently, he saw the movie several times. He became a Secret Service agent. He became the chief agent detailed to Reagan. When Reagan was hit by that maniac's bullets in the spring of 1981, it was Parr that pushed him into the car. The original orders were take him back to the White House. He's only been grazed. Parr was looking at him. Apparently, he was on top of Reagan, but Reagan's face was facing him. And he saw this white stuff coming out of his mouth. He was losing color. He said, no, I'm overruling y'all. We're taking him to the nearest hospital. They took him to George Washington Hospital. He had that surgery, and it essentially saved his life. Here was Jerry Parr, who had seen Reagan in 1939 in that Secret Service movie, saving his life as a Secret Service agent. It's such an unbelievable story. Parr passed away not too many years ago.
Wow.
That's an amazing story.
I mean, these are the things you only get from Paul George. I mean, you don't get this anywhere else.
No.
So Paul, John and I are a couple Neanderthals, and we can't finish the show without a little mafia conversation here,
Okay.
specifically Al Capone.
Yes.
So I have people that have told me, well, Al Capone lived here. Al Capone had an office here. Give us a little history of Al Capone's life in South Florida.
Well, in terms of where he lived and all that, has been so overstated. You know, he lived on Miami Beach. He bought a place, 93 Palm Avenue. It's a home that's been restored pretty nicely in recent years. He lived there, but the reality is that for much of so he moved in there in the late 20s. By the early 30s, he's in a federal prison in Pennsylvania, and then he's in Alcatraz, and then he's taken back east in another prison. He's finally released in 1939 with tertiary syphilis, goes back to Miami Beach to his mansion on Palm Island in 1940 and dies of some sort of a massive stroke or something in 1947. He was only 48 years of age. He died in that house that's still standing at 93 Palm Avenue. The whole thing about Capone was here and Capone was there was so overstated. If that was the case, he would have never slept. As it was, he wasn't really here in the 30s for the most part, you know, just barely at the beginning, at the very end. He went to the Olympia Theater to see a movie, and he was promptly arrested. It was an unconstitutional arrest, no basis for it. He went to see a boxing match on Biscayne Boulevard. There used to be an arena on the boulevard, not too far northeast of downtown. He was there for that. He went to Joe's Stone Crab. He would go early. We know that. He maybe had a hand in ownership of the Hollywood, Florida Country Club and golf course. And that may be true. He did own a portion of a sort of an island up in near Pompano Beach. That is probably true in terms of his holdings. But, you know, this here, there, and everywhere thing about Capone is just so overstated about where he was. He was essentially confined to his house when he came back in 40 because his mind wasn't functioning very well anymore. He had tertiary syphilis, and he would sit in his backyard. He had a pool there and fall asleep in a chair with a newspaper across his lap. And that was much of his day, was that.
But is it true? I've been to the Biltmore. Gene Singletary took me up to what they call the Capone Suite at the Biltmore Hotel. Is there any truth to that? I've often wondered, is this just something that they made up for marketing purposes or what?
We have no documentation at all that Capone ever stayed there. No documentation at all on that. And I love Gene Singletary, but we just we have no documentation on that. But I've heard it a million times. There was a guy named Rothstein who was a major crime figure who was the fixer of the World Series of 1919. He did stay in that suite, I guess in the late 20s. And there was a guy, Fatty Walsh, who was a criminal. He was killed disembarking from the elevator as you go into that suite. But other than that, I don't think there was a Capone presence there at all. And we know that President Clinton stayed there on numerous occasions.
Yeah, President Clinton loved the Biltmore, golf, poker up in that. You've been up in that suite before? Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, many times. It's fantastic. It's just beautiful.
It is. It's really the way it's sort of laid out. It's perfect for a group of 4 or 5 guys, play some poker and enjoy. But the story was, or the way it was told to me, that there's 2, if you look at the very top of the Biltmore, you see these balconies at the very top. And the way they tell the story was that his henchmen would stand there waiting to see if their, high stakes poker game was going to be raided by the police, and I always question, it's like George Washington slept everywhere, right?
Exactly.
Same.
No, I don't think it happened. I just don't think it happened.
Real quick, Paul, since we're on mafiosos, Meyer Lansky. I mean, obviously he was walking around Miami Beach for many years.
He was, and he never really served any jail time either. I mean, he was brought into court and stuff like that, but he liked to visit the Miami Beach Library, which was over there at that time in Collins Park. And he would bring his dog Bruiser, which was an overstatement. It was a tiny dog. He'd bring Bruiser with him. He lived up on Collins Avenue, I think in the 50s block, somewhere up there in a condo or whatever. But his last days on the planet were in 1983, and he went to Mount Sinai. He had, I talked to a doctor once there, and the doctor treated him. He had lung cancer. He was a heavy smoker, and he died. But the head of Mount Sinai at the time in '83 came up to the room where Meyer Lansky was, and there was one of Lansky's attendants was there and said, "Listen, if you need extra security, I can provide it." And the attendant said, "We won't need that." And as he said that, these two huge guys suddenly materialized. They came out of nowhere, and they were like the bodyguards. And the CEO of Mount Sinai told me, he said, "Once I saw those guys, I knew he didn't need any more security." So yeah, he was in and out of the federal courthouse in downtown Miami, hauled in there. But he had set up these two nightclubs and gambling places in Hallandale, which was strictly farm country. This is in the late 30s. Then was invited down by Batista to set up gambling in some of those hotels down there at the outset of the 40s in Cuba. So his brother Jake took over for him and some of the stuff he was involved with in the South Florida area. But he's a very interesting character, just so wily and was always avoided these imprisonments. I was just watching Godfather 2 a couple weeks ago, and they've got a Lansky character in there, and just soft-spoken but lethal.
Yeah, that was certainly based on Meyer Lansky, that role in The Godfather Part 2. But you mentioned the court in downtown Miami, the federal court, and there's been some salacious trials, some very prominent trials. Can you talk about a couple of them that have occurred right here in our community in downtown Miami?
Well, there's been the Noriega trial in the
Noriega
court, where he was incarcerated. They had an incarceration area under the court at one point. I think he was there, and that was a long trial. But some of the more salacious ones would happen in the nearby Dade County Courthouse, like Candace Mossler, who, along with her nephew/lover, was indicted for killing her husband, who was a wealthy banker. He was stabbed to death, over 100 stab wounds on Key Biscayne in 1964, and they were acquitted. They had an attorney, and it was a talk in the nation at the time. This is 1966, the trial. And the attorney, Percy Foreman, didn't use any notes, didn't call any witnesses, but he delivered a 6-hour summation to the jury and got them off on that. That was a salacious trial. There was another one in 1932. It was a love triangle where a famous British pilot killed a guy who had moved in on his lover. Her name was Chub Miller, and she was a famous woman pilot, British. And they were living in Shenandoah off of Coral Way and 22nd or 23rd Avenue. And he was acquitted also in this trial. And that was the Dade County Courthouse. So we've had so many cases, that, as you mentioned, Andy, border on the salacious. The Candace Mossler thing was so heated because the testimony was so heavy. The Candace Mossler thing was so heated that the Miami News was putting out, instead of the blue streak, the afternoon update sheet, they were putting out the pink streak. And they had to didact a lot of words from it because of the testimony there. Or there was the killing of Stanley Cohen over there on Bayshore Drive in 17th Avenue. And all the testimony, Joyce Cohen was convicted and sent to a prison. She's been in a couple of different prisons in Florida since then. And she did almost a Marie Antoinette. She went in with her hair black in prison. From what I've heard, it changed almost overnight to white or gray. And that was a salacious trial too.
It sure was.
Yep.
It sure was. Well, you know what I love about Paul George? He knows the damn name of Meyer Lansky's dog. Okay. Bruiser. I mean, my gosh.
Yeah.
Paul, before we let you go, I want to thank you for coming and joining us here at Miami Community News. Tell anyone that's watching this program, whether now live or later, let them know how they can participate in some of your tours and what's going on at History Miami.
Well, I'd love to have them partake in the tours in History Miami. We've got the Biscayne Boulevard tour from 6 till 7 p.m. next Friday. You can go to historymiami.org and you could register there for it. It's very affordable. I'm offering a class in Miami, South Florida history in March over a period of about 5 Tuesdays. And then later in the year, a Florida history class. But I think the best connection would be historymiami.org, or you can call me and I can help you. My cell phone number is 305-206-4025. But we got all kind of exhibitions at History Miami, classes, talks on different topics. I talked about the pandemic from 1918, 1919 several months ago. talked about the history of Princeton, Florida, a little more recent than that. So there's different talks, but you can always go to the website and they will list the different things happening in History of Miami, the exhibitions down there. You would
And
love
again,
it.
the website address one more time.
Historyofmiami.org.
Okay.
One word, historyofmiami.org. And call me if you need to at 305-206-4025. I just came out. I co-wrote a book on the Brickell Avenue neighborhood, largely pictorial. Some people might be interested in that, and I have copies of it if they're interested.
Great. Well, it sounds great. And just for personal reasons, that March class, because maybe I'll join you on that one.
Love to have you do it.
That is, what time of the day is that?
It's going to be in the afternoon, but it is archived for 24 hours. So if you're a student in that and you aren't able to, say, attend it on real time, you could go on the computer at 6 p.m. or 3 a.m. and you could pick up that whole class within that 24-hour time frame.
Excellent. Well, listen, Paul George, you're just a treasure here in our community. And I really want to thank you for coming here today at Miami Community News and participating in our show here this morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul George, for joining us today at Miami Community News.
Great seeing you, Paul.
Good to be here. Hi, John. Thanks. It's so good being here. And I'm so glad we could do this. And thanks again. And have a great day, too.
You too. Stay safe, Paul. Okay. Well, there you go, John. I mean, isn't that something? I mean, it's really great when you could sit here and have those types of conversations, and learn about the community that we live in, because it's our history that binds us together. We've seen so much division in our country, especially over the last year, more than ever. And, we're all hoping to unite again under a new president, under many new people up in Washington and in the Senate and the House. We want unity. And there's one thing that binds us is that deep history that we have. Yep. Paul just talking about it here in South Florida.
And the history of South Florida is so rich. And we could have had a conversation with Paul all day.
Yeah.
And been completely enlightened on so many things.
Yeah.
And we are natives of Miami. We were born and raised here. And every conversation we have with Paul, we leave, or I leave, with enlightened in some way.
You always learn something. I mean, I learned Bruiser. Meyer Lansky's dog was a little Chihuahua or something called Bruiser.
I was thinking at one point we would stump Paul, ask him a question about Miami that he would just have a puzzled look on his face. Never will happen.
No.
Bruiser was the icing on the cake. We will never stump Paul on anything.
Well, I'll tell you the one story before we leave that really, the one of that young kid that went to the movie with his dad, saw the Secret Service movie at the Tower Theater, and then became the number one detail on President Reagan, and was there when he got shot in 1981.
Right.
I mean,
it saved his life.
Threw
him in the car and told him take him to the
hospital right away.
It's amazing.
I mean, what a kind of story. I never knew. Did you know that?
No. And because we grew up in that area, we've driven by the Tower Theater
a million times,
and the history of that theater is unbelievable when you look into it. I'm sure
it's really something, and it's really something we can appreciate, sort of, our community and the history of our community, because, as you say, John, it is a rich history, although not as long as, a lot of other places, like a Boston or a New York or a Chicago, but rich nonetheless.
And I learned today, I couldn't figure out why we had the two conventions in 72. Obviously, he enlightened me. He said San Diego evidently dumped it or whatever. There was something that they didn't meet. And the next thing you know, they were doing them both here, which is amazing.
Yeah, it's something. I did want to ask him if the Bubba's Beach Bash at the Fontainebleau, that is apparently President Clinton's annual event there in the hot tub. I wanted to ask him if that was true or not, or was that just something I made up in my mind? Probably. I think that might be.
Well, if it was true, he was there.
He would
tell us what they were serving in the way of food.
Exactly. He would tell us what kind of cigars they were smoking during that event. But well, John, thanks so much. Oh, before we leave, I know that you are the publicist. You are a PR guru in South Florida. Auto show, you've been doing the auto show forever and ever and ever.
Right.
Are we seeing an auto show in 2021?
We are planning to move forward with an auto show in 2021. We're waiting to see whether it's May or perhaps a little later, but the goal is, depending on how things are looking for our community and the safety protocols that are in place, the hope is that we will do some type of auto show at the Miami Beach Convention Center.
I really hope that, because I know that if I'm walking through the convention center, looking at those great automobiles, that's one event I just won't miss every year. I know that we'll be back to some normalcy.
I hope so. I mean, I know that the auto manufacturers, and talking to them, are excited to show their products. Camp Jeep, which is a really fun activation, is already committed, and that, of course, is outdoors at the convention center.
Yeah, that's great.
So that's always fun,
Right.
and hopefully there'll be some type of auto show that we can leap on and springboard into other things.
Well, I'll keep my fingers crossed. I mean, I everything I read, the auto dealers are actually doing pretty good during this pandemic.
They are doing good. Thankfully, people are, still got to get from point A to point B.
Right. So, well, John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're
Andrew.
quite an addition to the show. Thank you for joining us today here at Miami Community Newspapers. The hub of local news and information in Miami-Dade County is here at Miami Community News. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. And we will see you Monday right here at Miami Community Newspapers.